The galactic peacekeepers had one golden rule, written in every manual from the Andromeda core to the Outer Rim: never let a human reach level 5 rage. Most alien species laughed at this. They looked at humans, with their soft skin, lack of claws, and fragile bones, and thought the rule was a joke. They thought level 5 was just a medical term for a fast heartbeat. They were dead wrong. In the center of the High Council's massive docking bay, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and expensive fuel. Commander Jax, a 3-meter-tall reptilian with scales as hard as tank armor, stood towering over a young human named Elias. Jax was a bully in a uniform, a high-ranking official who loved to show his power over lesser species. With a cruel grin, Jax lifted his massive 3-fingered claw. Between his scales sat a small, silver communication tablet. To the aliens, it was just a piece of plastic and glass. To Elias, it was everything. It held the voice recordings of his daughter on Earth, and the only way to call home across the light years of cold space. Crunch. The sound echoed through the silent bay. Jax dropped the shattered remains of the tablet at Elias's feet. "Oops," Jax hissed, his forked tongue flickering with delight. "It seems your primitive toy couldn't handle the pressure. Just like your species." The surrounding crowd of alien diplomats and guards snickered. They expected Elias to do what humans usually do: shout, cry, or perhaps beg for a replacement. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see the weak human break. But Elias didn't yell. He didn't drop to his knees to pick up the broken glass. Instead, he just stopped. He stood perfectly still. His hands, which had been shaking with anxiety moments ago, became steady as rocks. His breathing changed. It wasn't the shallow gasping of a scared man. It was deep, slow, and rhythmic. It sounded like a heavy engine idling in the dark. "Calm down, tiny creature," Jax said, puffing out his chest to look even bigger. He stepped into Elias's personal space, his shadow swallowing the human whole. "We are de-escalating this situation for your own safety. You humans are so emotional. It's bad for your health." The air in the docking bay suddenly felt heavy. It wasn't just a feeling. The temperature around Elias actually seemed to drop. On the walls, the advanced alien sensors began to pulse with a frantic orange light. A flat, mechanical voice echoed over the intercom system, sounding genuinely confused. "Warm. Ukebmobiobi haikautaki o upiutated imanad imiliorilight putin rasasajunasam is a YSDAM failure eminent." Jax let out a barking laugh, looking up at the speakers. "A warning. For one small, harmless human. Your sensors are broken, computer. Look at him, he's paralyzed with fear. He's not doing anything." Jax turned back to Elias, leaning down until his reptilian snout was inches from the human's face. He wanted to see the tears. He wanted to see Elias blink. But Elias's eyes weren't looking at Jax anymore. They were looking through him, focused on a point somewhere in the distant stars. The human's pupils had dilated until his eyes looked like 2 black holes. There was no sadness there. There was no fear. There was only a cold, predatory focus that had been buried under thousands of years of civilization. "You should have looked at the manual, Jax," Elias whispered. His voice was quiet, but it carried further than the commander's roar. "What did you say, monkey?" Jax sneered. "The manual," Elias repeated, his muscles suddenly rippling under his thin shirt like coiled steel. "It says level 5 isn't about anger. It's about the moment the brain stops caring if the body survives. It's the moment we stop being people and start being hunters." Jax felt a sudden, sharp chill run down his spine. For the first time in his life, his instincts screamed at him to run. He realized too late that for a human, calm doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means the internal locks have been broken. Sometimes it means the safety is already off. And once a human takes the safety off, they don't stop until the job is done. The atmosphere in the High Council docking bay didn't just change, it shattered. Usually when a species gets angry, they make noise. They growl, they hiss, or they roar to show their strength. But as the crowd of alien diplomats and security guards watched Elias, the silence coming from the small human was more terrifying than any war cry. It was the silence of a deep sea predator just before it strikes. The spectators began to back away, their hooves and claws clicking nervously against the metallic floor. They had seen humans in the galactic markets before. They knew them as talkative, friendly, and sometimes even annoying. They had seen humans laugh until they turned red and cry over sad holovids. But they had never seen a human go completely, terrifyingly still. Elias's eyes, which only minutes ago were filled with warmth and a soft brown hue, had transformed. The pupils had dilated so much that they looked like 2 discs of polished obsidian, cold hard, and unblinking. It was as if the person, named Elias, had gone on vacation, and something much older, something from the prehistoric jungles of Earth, had stepped into his place to handle the situation. Commander Jax, however, was too arrogant to feel the shift in the air. He was a creature of ego, and his ego told him that size was the only thing that mattered. He looked at the medical scanners flickering on the wall, which were now screaming in a frantic, high-pitched tone. The scanners were displaying Elias's vitals to the entire room. His heart rate, which should have been skyrocketing from fear, was actually dropping. It settled into a steady, rhythmic thud, a heavy, mechanical beat that suggested his body was entering a state of hyper-focus. But the most alarming part was the muscle tension index. The bar on the screen had turned a violent shade of purple, moving past the limits of biological life. It showed that Elias's muscle fibers were tensing with enough torque to snap a titanium support beam. "I said, back away, monkey!" Jax shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He was losing his patience. He didn't like the way this small creature was looking at him. It made his scales itch. To regain control, Jax reached out with his massive, heavy claw, intending to grab Elias by the shoulder and slam him into the deck plating. He expected the human to flinch. He expected him to cower. He was wrong. Before Jax's claw could even graze the fabric of Elias's shirt, the human moved. It wasn't a normal human movement. There was no wind-up, no telltale sign of a struggle. It was a blur of pure kinetic energy. To the onlookers, it looked like Elias had simply teleported. In a split second, Elias's hand, a hand that looked so small compared to the commander's, was wrapped firmly around Jax's thick, armored wrist. The sound that followed was one no one in the bay would ever forget. It was the sound of high-grade military armor groaning. The metal plates on Jax's wrist began to buckle and warp under the sheer pressure of Elias's grip. Jax froze. He looked down at his arm, his golden eyes wide with shock. He tried to pull back, but it was like being anchored to a mountain. What are you doing?" Jax stammered, his voice losing its edge. He felt the bones in his arm begin to creak.
"Let go of me, guards."
"Arrest this animal?" The guards hesitated. Their advanced bio-scanners were giving them a red-level, extreme threat warning. According to the computers, the organism standing in front of them wasn't just a human anymore. It was a biological engine running at 200% capacity. The human body has limiters, natural locks in the brain that stop us from using our full strength so we don't accidentally tear our own muscles or break our own bones. But in extreme moments of level 5, rage or survival, the brain throws those locks away. It decides that the body's survival is more important than the body's safety. Elias was currently using every ounce of power his DNA had spent millions of years perfecting. His skin was hot to the touch, steam almost seemingly rising from his shoulders as his internal temperature spiked. He wasn't just strong, he was a biological miracle of destruction. Elias leaned in closer to the towering reptile. He didn't look up at him like a victim looking at a bully. He looked at him like an engineer looking at a machine he was about to dismantle. "You told me to calm down," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "This is me being calm. You don't want to see me lose my temper." Jax tried to swing his other claw, but Elias simply shifted his weight, and the commander found himself face down on the cold floor in an instant. The tiny creature had just grounded a 300-kilogram warrior with a single flick of his wrist. The galaxy had always wondered why humans were so obsessed with superhero stories. Looking at Elias now, the aliens in the room finally understood. Humans didn't write those stories because they wanted to be powerful. They wrote them as a warning of what they actually were when the masks of civilization finally slipped off. The biological terror had just begun. The silence in the docking bay was broken only by the mechanical hum of the peacekeeper drones. 6 of them, sleek and silver, hovered in a semi-circle around Elias, their red targeting lasers painted small, burning dots across his chest and forehead. The automated voice of the station's security AI boomed through the speakers. "Human CBJC 429, Agi Reza and MDDLY, DE Skelotio Pioko NFFET. Commander Jax was still pinned to the floor, his massive reptilian tail thrashing in a mix of panic and pain. "Kill him," Jax roared, his voice cracking.
"He's a defect. He's a monster. Look at his eyes."
The drones didn't kill, at least, not yet. They were programmed for mercy. From the vents in the ceiling, a thick, swirling blue mist began to pour down. This was the famous soporific 9 gas. It was a powerful neurotoxin used to pacify riotous crowds or knock out massive Thraxian beasts during transport. One whiff of it would usually send a sentient being into a deep, dreamless sleep in less than 3 seconds. The alien diplomats in the observation deck watched with relief. They adjusted their breathing masks, waiting for the small human to crumple into a heap on the cold metal floor. They expected the biological terror to end with a quiet thud. But as the blue mist settled around Elias, something impossible happened. The gas didn't just fail, it seemed to evaporate the moment it touched his skin. Elias was radiating so much body heat that the air around him was shimmering like a desert road at noon. His metabolism, fueled by a level of adrenaline the galaxy had never witnessed, was running at a speed that defied alien biology. His liver and kidneys were filtering the toxins out of his bloodstream before they could even reach his brain. His heart was a drum, his blood was liquid fire, and his lungs were simply rejecting the foreign chemicals. As the mist cleared, the room went cold with a different kind of fear. Elias was still standing. He hadn't even blinked. The drones paused, their sensors spinning in confusion. They were programmed to handle life forms that followed the laws of nature. They weren't prepared for a human whose sheer willpower had told his biology to ignore the rules. Elias looked up at the drones. For the first time since the tablet had shattered, he spoke. His voice wasn't a scream. It wasn't the loud, boisterous shouting the aliens were used to hearing from humans. It was a low, vibrating whisper, a sound that felt like it was coming from the bottom of an ancient, dark well. "You broke the only thing that kept me connected to home," Elias said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. That tablet had the last recording of my daughter's voice. It had the only map back to the sector where my family is waiting. You didn't just break a machine. You broke the bridge. Commander Jax, sensing a moment of hesitation, tried to scramble away, but Elias's grip on the commander's wrist didn't loosen. Instead, Elias pulled. With a grunt of effort that sounded more like a growl, Elias swung the 300-kilogram reptilian around as if he were made of nothing but straw and paper. "Warning, target is non-compliant." The drones chirped. They switched from gas to active suppression. Blue bolts of electricity, stun lasers meant to paralyze the nervous system, shot out and slammed into Elias's back. The crowd gasped. That much electricity should have stopped a human heart instantly. Elias's body jerked for a second, his muscles locking under the high-voltage current. But then, to the horror of everyone watching, he turned his head. He looked at the drone that had fired the shot. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face, a grin that didn't reach his obsidian eyes. It was the look of a creature that had moved past pain. He had entered the berserker state, a legendary human condition where the brain mutes the pain receptors to allow the body to finish the fight. "My turn," Elias whispered. In one explosive motion, Elias released Jax and leaped. It was a jump that shouldn't have been possible in the station's standard gravity. He caught the nearest drone with both hands, his fingers digging into the reinforced alloy frame like it was soft clay. With a guttural roar, he twisted. Crack! The drone sparked and died, its internal computer shrieking as Elias tore the heavy plating right off its chassis. He didn't stop. He used the dead drone as a shield, charging toward the next one with a speed that the security cameras could barely track. The peacekeepers had failed. The gas had failed. The electricity had failed. They had tried to de-escalate a man who had nothing left to lose, and in doing so, they had accidentally unlocked the most dangerous thing in the universe, a human who has forgotten how to feel fear. The docking bay had become a graveyard of high-tech failure. The air was filled with the smell of burnt wires and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Above, behind the reinforced, blast-proof glass of the observation deck, the High Council members were no longer sitting in their comfortable chairs. They were pressed against the windows, their many eyes wide with a terror they hadn't felt in centuries. They had spent years studying human psychology. They had read books on human philosophy, art, and music. They thought they understood the civilized human. They believed that because humans built cafes and wrote poetry, they had evolved past their violent roots. But as they looked down at Elias, they realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had studied the human, but they had completely forgotten about the earthling. They forgot that humans didn't come from a peaceful paradise. They came from a planet of storms, predators, and endless survival. Down on the floor, the remaining drones were malfunctioning. Their AI brains couldn't calculate a way to stop a target that simply ignored pain. They fired blue electricity in desperate bursts, hitting Elias squarely in the chest. Any other species would have suffered a total nervous system collapse. Their hearts would have stopped. But Elias didn't even flinch. His body was so flooded with adrenaline and cortisol that his nerves were firing faster than the electricity could disrupt them. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace. Using Commander Jax's thick, armored arm as a solid lever, Elias swung his body upward with the strength of a jungle cat. His heavy work boot connected with the lead drone with a sickening thud. The drone, a multi-million credit piece of military hardware, flew across the room and embedded itself deep into the metal ceiling, sparking and dying like a broken toy. Commander Jax scrambled backward, his heavy tail dragging on the floor. He was no longer the proud, arrogant officer. He was a cornered animal. "Stay back," Jax screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched fear. We were just following the rules. We have to maintain order." The tablet was an accident. Protocol dictates that emotional outbursts must be suppressed. Elias didn't stop. He stepped over the twitching remains of a drone, his eyes locked onto Jax. Every step he took felt like a hammer blow to the room's remaining silence. "Order?" Elias asked. His voice was calm, but it was the kind of calm that comes before a hurricane hits the shore. "Is that what you call it? You take away our history, you monitor our calls, and you break the only link I have to my daughter's voice. You don't want order, Jax. You want control. You want to make sure the Death Worlders stay small and quiet." Elias stopped just inches away from the trembling commander. The heat coming off the human was so intense that Jax could feel his own scales drying out. "The problem with control," Elias whispered, leaning down so his face was level with the reptiles, "is that it only works if the other person is afraid to die. And right now, I'm not even sure I'm still alive. I think I'm just rage wrapped in skin." In the observation deck, the High Chancellor turned to his security chief.
Seal the bay. Call the heavy infantry.
"Why isn't he stopping?" The security chief, a veteran of a dozen galactic wars, just shook his head. "Sir, we've made a terrible mistake. We treated him like a soldier. We should have treated him like a father. A soldier fights because he's told to. A father fights because he has nothing left but the memory of what he's protecting. You can't de-escalate love turned into spite." Jax looked up at the glass, pleading for help, but the council was already backing away from the windows. They were realizing that their perfect order was built on the assumption that everyone would play by the rules. They never prepared for the day a human would simply stand up and rewrite the rulebook with his bare hands. Elias reached down and picked up the largest piece of his broken tablet. He looked at the cracked screen, then back at Jax. The safety wasn't just off, it was gone. The bridge was burned, and as the heavy blast doors of the docking bay began to slide shut, locking the predator and the prey inside together, the galaxy finally understood humanity wasn't dangerous because they loved war. They were dangerous because of what they were willing to do to get back to peace. The heavy blast doors hissed open, and the elite security force flooded into the docking bay. These were the Iron Guard. Soldiers from 5 different systems, armed with heavy pulse rifles and wearing gravity-defying combat suits. They were trained to stop planetary invasions. They were trained to fight gods. But as they stepped over the threshold, they didn't fire. They didn't even raise their weapons to their shoulders. They just stopped. The sight before them was something that would be talked about in every military academy in the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. In the center of the wreckage, surrounded by the smoking remains of millions of credits worth of security drones, stood Elias. He was small, unbelievably small compared to the chaos he had caused. He wasn't wearing armor. He didn't have a weapon. He was just a man in a torn-work shirt, his knuckles white and bleeding, his breathing finally slowing down as the steam stopped rising from his skin. Commander Jax was still on the floor, curled into a ball. He wasn't dead, but his spirit was shattered. The bully of the stars was shaking, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at the human who had just dismantled his world. The Iron Guard stood frozen because their tactical HUDs were screaming at them. Even now, with the fight over, the bio-scanners were marking Elias as a Class S hazard. Their computers were telling them that the human's internal systems were still running at a level that should be biologically impossible. It was like looking at a nuclear reactor that had just narrowly avoided a meltdown. The core was still glowing, and no one wanted to be the one to poke it. Elias didn't look at the soldiers. He didn't seem to care about the rifles pointed at his heart. With a slow, steady motion, he reached down into the pile of broken glass and metal at his feet. He picked up the largest piece of his crushed communication tablet. The screen was black, a spiderweb of cracks hiding the faces of the family he loved. He looked directly into the security camera mounted on the far wall. He knew the High Council was on the other side of that lens, watching from their ivory towers. "Tell the Council," Elias said. His voice was no longer a whisper, but it wasn't a shout either. It was a cold, hard fact. "Next time you try to escalate a human, make sure you know what you're turning off. We spend our whole lives keeping our own power in check. We build rules, we build laws, and we build manners just so we don't have to be this thing every day." He held up the broken piece of his tablet. "But once you break the things we love, once you take the safety off, you can't just flip a switch and put it back. You wanted to see the real Earth. Now you've seen it. Elias turned and began to walk toward the exit. The Iron Guard, the most feared soldiers in the quadrant, stepped aside. They didn't just move. They scrambled to get out of his way. They parted like the sea before a storm. No one dared to touch him. No one dared to say a word. As Elias disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, the docking bay's sensors finally stopped screaming. But the light stayed red. It was a permanent reminder of the day the galaxy's perfect order met human spite. In the weeks that followed, the Level 5 rule was rewritten. It was no longer a medical warning. It was a diplomatic directive. The Council issued a new decree: humans were to be given total privacy. Their personal belongings were declared sacred, and under no circumstances was a human to be pacified without their explicit consent. Commander Jax was quietly retired. He never spoke of that day, but it was said he could never stay in a room with a human again without his scales turning gray with fear. The galaxy finally understood a dark truth they had ignored for far too long. A shouting human is just angry. A crying human is just hurt. But a quiet human, a human who has stopped making noise and started breathing deep, that is the most dangerous thing in the stars. Because a quiet human has already decided that the talking is over, and the reckoning has begun. The harmless. Humans weren't harmless at all. They were just the only species in the universe kind enough to keep their own safety on, until someone was foolish enough to break it.